Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much indeed from us at the IMechE for joining us on this Managing Risk, Make Your Project a Success webinar. It's nice to see so many people arriving early for us. We're going to be starting promptly at 12:30 when I'm Andrew Bailey. I work for the institution. We'll be introducing Steve Kendall, a project management and leadership expert, and Steve's going to walk us through 55 minutes to an hour of insight around managing risk with projects. Thank you again for joining so quickly. We'll be back to you soon. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for following some of the instructions on our introductory slide. It's nice to see people introducing themselves. It's nice to see that we're getting people from a number of destinations, which is what we expect. I can see that there are some people coming in from London. I've seen some people coming in from Liverpool. I have also seen Sarah. You just came in from a second or two. You're in Leicester. So lovely, ladies and gentlemen, to see the introductions going on. It's 12:20 at the moment. We'll be starting promptly in 10 minutes' time, and please keep them coming. It's lovely to be welcoming you and seeing you there for us today. Thank you. That's great. Thank you, joining from Perth in Western Australia. That's really nice to see that you're in a different time zone. There's a host of people from around the United Kingdom joining. And, of course, we're at lunchtime at the moment. But in Perth, that won't be the case. So thank you very much indeed for joining. It's 23 minutes past 12, noon, 23 minutes past noon in the UK in our time zone, and we'll be starting in around about 7 minutes. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. It's bang on 12:30 UK timeline. For those of you who are on 10 minutes ago, I was waxing lyrical about somebody joining us from Perth in Australia. And please, I didn't mean to insult any of you in Darlington, Kent, Bristol, Shetland, Aberdeen, and also some joiners from Portugal and from Russia. It's just an absolute delight to see so many different people joining us today for 55 minutes to an hour's discussion with a real expert on managing risk and making your project a success. My name's Andrew Bailey. I'm going to moderate this webinar. You won't hear very much from me, but I'll be looking at the chat box on a very, very regular basis to make sure that Steve can concentrate on his slides and the stories and the messages that he's got to tell you. This is a suite of webinars that Steve and I have compiled, Steve particularly, that Steve, you can see there on the left of your screen, and I'm on the right of your screen talking now. Steve's had more than 25 years experience in project leadership and project management, and he is particularly expert at and passionate, I would say, about managing change through projects. One of the things which we know arrives when we are using projects or just working in business in general, in any type of sector, but particularly engineering, is that risk occurs. And so this is about identifying, minimizing, being ready for risk. The more we're ready, the less risky the whole piece actually is. What we want to make sure is that you've got some real familiarity. At the end of 55 minutes to an hour, you've got some real familiarity with techniques for risk management. And we like to think that you could go away from here and immediately help to make your projects more successful. I'm going to take, in a minute or two, I'm going to hand straight over to Steve, who's going to talk you through the agenda. That won't take you 1 second as I move from where I am at the moment through to moving the controls to Steve. And Steve, I think we're now in your very, very capable hands. Ladies and gentlemen, Steve Kendall.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks for the introduction. Just checking that you can hear me. Andrew? Is everything okay? Can you hear me, folks?
Steve, we can hear you. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I just want to begin by saying I like to think of our topic for today, which is managing risk, like this. For me, I see a project is a bit like a journey, and a project plan is a bit like a map. to help you on that journey. And then the risks are those things which could cause detours, could cause deviations from that. So in other words, if you avoid the risks, you will arrive successfully at the destination. So for me, risk management is a really, really important part of managing projects, because these are the things that could make it go wrong. So we have just an hour today, so this is an introduction, an overview of the subject. It will give you some familiarity with some simple techniques. I think they are simple, but I think they're profound in their effectiveness. I don't think we need to have a huge amount of complexity in the risk management process, but it can be really, really helpful in making the project a success, which is what we're looking for. So just to move swiftly through an overview of the agenda, we're going to start off with, well, why is risk management so important? We'll have a look at the language of risk. There are a few bits of language, which is good to have a common language about risks when we're talking about risks. We will look at the overall process for managing risks, and then we'll have a look at a few specific techniques. And then the important part, really, so we're not just looking at risk analysis, but we're looking at risk management, is what do we do about these risks? What are the range of responses that we have available to us to manage the risks? And then lastly, we'll look at some positives and some negatives. How to avoid common pitfalls. I wouldn't like you to think that everything is rosy and wonderful about this. There are some things that we need to be on the lookout for when we're using these risk management techniques, and correspondingly some things that, in my opinion, really make this work, make it more than just a box-ticking exercise, but it's there to make the project successful. And hopefully at the end we'll have a bit of time for a few questions and some answers. Okay. So first of all then, why should we be bothered with risk management? You'll see that I've put at the top of my slide here, first of all, fewer nasty surprises. That just sounds very innocuous and a bit of a throwaway line. It is not at all, really, because I think we could have a project that is on time, within budget, but if there are some stakeholders who say, well, that isn't what I was expecting, or I thought it was going to do this as well, then I think we have failed. So as well as thinking about things like efficient use of resources and being on time and not overspending, I think we need to be thinking about how we minimize the chances of there being some nasty surprises. I've also put in there, reduce time spent firefighting, in other words, being reactive to problems as they come along. I remember hearing some time ago, somebody said to me that people who spend some of their time firefighting are probably also responsible for starting quite a lot of fires. So this is about being proactive, not being reactive, and trying to make the future a bit better. The language of risk then. A few bits of terminology here that I think are very, very helpful. Okay, first of all, a definition of risk. There's a mouthful here from the APM. The APM is the UK Chartered Body for Project Management, the Association for Project Management, and they have a definition of risk that goes like this. It is an uncertain event or set of circumstances that, should it occur, will have an effect on achievement of one or more objectives, which is quite a bit of a mouthful. I quite like the Oxford English Dictionary, the OED's definition. I'm speaking to you from Oxford today, so this is a bit hometown for me. Exposure to danger. I like those two aspects. When we're talking about risk, it's about exposure and it's about danger. Then we have some more language here. First of all, the idea that different projects may have different risk appetites. They can stand different amounts of risk. And I would just like to ask a question of you folks out there, and it's this. What would happen to an organisation that only did low-risk projects? What do you think that would be the result of an organisation just only taking on low-risk projects? Let's just give you a few moments to perhaps type in some thoughts on that. If an organisation just does low-risk projects, is this a good thing? Is it a bad thing? What do you think? So I'm seeing things here about low rewards, no innovation, no development, no risk, no reward. Yeah, I think if an organisation only does low-risk projects, what would probably happen to them is they'll slowly go out of business. So there will be, they would develop it, but in small steps, Ruth's saying, better success, but no development. Yeah, they will gradually become uncompetitive. What about the other extreme? What about an organisation that only does high-risk projects? An organisation that only does high-risk projects. What would be the consequences of that, do you think? Give you a few moments to see some results on this. Potentially unsustainable, opportunity to do very well, or fail completely, says Joe. I absolutely agree with that. I think that's a perfect response here, is that the organisation that only does high-risk projects, they may be spectacularly successful, they may be spectacularly unsuccessful, but it's impossible to predict, really, if they only do high-risk projects. So what we're saying here is that for most organisations, what they will attempt to do is to have a large percentage of projects which are fairly low risk. They are their bread and butter projects, the projects that they can rely on to generate the majority of their income, with a sprinkling of a small percentage of high-risk projects where they know that not all of them will succeed. But it's worth doing because if only one or two of them succeed, then the rewards will be great, as Bruce has just said here, greater possibility of high returns. So it's about having the balance right, of not just sort of being wishy-washy in the middle, but having a proportion of low-risk projects and a sprinkling of high-risk projects. So we can say that not all projects will have the same risk appetite, to use that bit of language there. And the risk owner, then, when we are talking later on about the responses to risk, we will be using this concept of the risk owner, the person who has responsibility for ensuring that the responses to risks are carried out. And then something that's quite important in terms of shades of meaning, really, is the difference between risks and issues. So very simply we can say issues are things that have happened. They're here. They're now. We've got to do something about it. Whereas risks are about things that might happen. They're things that could happen in the future. So let's take a look now at the risk management process. So we're going to use a risk management process to make sure that every risk that we can think of has been identified, and that we've assessed it, to assess each of the risks, and identify actions that we could put in place to reduce them. Not all risks will be of equal priority, so we'll be having a look at how we can assess them to decide that. And something that personally, my view is that risk management and risk planning is part of overall project planning, that it's not a separate subject. We don't create a project plan and then do our risk management activities. And the reason being simply that once we look at risk management, we will identify some actions, some tasks, which need to be included in the project plan from the outset, rather than being bolted on later. Oh dear, we need a bit more time, or we need a bit more effort to do this. No, it's part of project planning. And the other thing to say about the risk management process is that it's not a once and for all thing. It's not something we just do once at the outset of the project and that's it. What we should do is come back regularly and have a look at our risk assessment to say, well, there are some things that we may be able to remove from the list. We can say that if this was going to happen, it would have happened by now. It's no longer relevant. We can take it off. We don't need to be worrying about that. On the other hand, partway through the project, it may be apparent that there are some other risks that we didn't know about at the outset, and they need to be added in. So my view there is risks should be regularly reviewed.
Steve, can I just point something out that's coming from Bruce? And by the way,
yes, please do, Andrew.
Thank you for all of the comments that are coming in. I can assure you we're reading every one of them. They're coming in thick and fast. There's over 200 people on this line at this moment in time, but we are reading every one of them. Something that Bruce pointed out, which often we might not think about, is in a very dynamic, high-risk environment, there is a really significant stress on staff. And we talk a great deal, or one would expect us to talk a great deal about the commercial dangers of the project failing. But the stress that could be put on staff, the need to constantly be hiring staff, the turnover of staff is another really significant risk. And I wondered, Steve, have you experienced anything like this in any of the high-risk projects that you've worked with?
I think I've seen it. Andrew, thanks for coming in and spotting that and pointing that out, bringing it to my attention. What I've seen, I think, are some organisations who, I'm trying to think of the expression that was used about this, it was banking goodwill, where the pressures and the expectations on staff were unrealistically high, and I suppose ultimately probably did result in staff turnover. But before that, there are other things that you might see. Stressed out people tend to get sick more frequently. There's absenteeism, and there's just general stressful atmosphere around, which I can think of one or two organisations where I've seen that, where stress, a little bit of stress from time to time is probably a good thing, a bit of a challenge. But if the pressure is constantly there, it becomes very difficult to maintain high performance under that level of pressure. Does that help, Andrew?
I think that's perfect, Stephen. It's another great comment. And Bruce has very kindly pointed out to me that this was actually Joe's comment and not his. In my speed dashing through the list, I actually got the wrong participant. So Bruce, thank you, and Joe, thank you, and Steve, thank you. And now I'm going to go back on mute again. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. It occurs to me that the word regularly is, it doesn't say anything about frequency. And I'm often asked by people, how often, how frequently should we be reviewing risks? Now, I know of some organisations who make sure that every project has a review of risks every week. And that may work very well for them, but it does seem, that seems a little bit excessive to me, in my humble opinion. It might be true that for a fairly small project that a weekly review might be very suitable, because if you don't do it, then your project will be over before there's been a review. But for larger projects, I would say perhaps a monthly review might be more appropriate. Moving on to my next slide here. So the risk management process, then, we can say, if we start at the top there with identifying the risks, let's find out what are all the risks that might be encountered on this project. And then the next step, moving around to the right, looking at assessing the risks to decide how serious are they? How can we? What are the ones that we should prioritise to do something about? And then we will plan our responses to the risks. And this is where, on that final step there, the management, where the project manager's role is to make sure that these risk actions are taking place. And as you can see, it goes back to the beginning again, because we're saying this is a regular thing. We need to do it more often than just once. Move this on here. So the risk management process, we will have a look at each of these steps in turn. We'll look at identifying the risks, of being aware of what the risks are, identifying them, evaluating them using a qualitative and quantitative or quantitative approach. We'll identify the highest levels of risk that we really need to do something about, and thinking about what's the best way of reducing each risk, and allocating this person, the risk owner, which may in some cases be the project manager, maybe team members. Each risk needs to have a risk owner, and we revise the plan to incorporate, as the plan is being drawn up, to incorporate these new actions, these new tasks. Otherwise, we haven't reduced the level of risk on the project at all. So let's have a look at some of the techniques that we can use for that process. Here's an example of something that's called either a risk register or a risk log. I've kept this down to the essential minimum to say these few columns that we've got here, what have we got, 6 columns, where we will we'll do a worked example of this later on, but we're starting off with a description of the risk. So we can look at each activity in the project, and you might think that certain activities are more risky than others, but it's not the activity that we're going to put in there. For instance, you might think we've got to have some software written as part of this project. That's a bit risky. If we just put writing software in the risk description, that's not telling me what the risk is. To take a simple example, if we were to say the software might be delivered late, now that's a description of the risk. It's not the activity, but it's the risk within the activity. So we're going to have a look at each of these columns in turn. One technique that you can use for identifying risks is a technique that's given this acronym, PESTLE analysis, where rather than just thinking about all of the risks in one big bucket or black hole, as we go through these 6 headings and say, are there any things happening in the political sphere, the political arena, that may affect this project? Is it Brexit? Is there going to be an election? Is the government putting more funding or less funding into this area? Are there things that are happening in the political field that might affect this project? The first E then would be economic. Are there economic factors? What about interest rates, exchange rates, availability of venture capital? A whole bunch of questions related to economics that might be an important, relevant background for helping us understand the risks. Then we could look at the S, the sociological trends. Are there any factors such as migration, demographics, aging population, the sociological trends that might be relevant for this project? I can just stop at that point. I've seen a comment from Ron about residual risk. I'd like to come back to that later. I think what we'll do is start with the basic essential, as I say, the essential minimum. But what we can do is, having completed a first pass through the risk register, say, right, if we include the actions that we have identified, now what is the level of risk that remains, the residual risk on this project? So thank you for that comment, Ron. Where do we get to? T, for technical. Are there technological aspects to this project that are relevant for the risks? Is it leading-edge technology, which might be particularly risky? Is it long-standing, stable technology? What are the technical and technological risks in this project? Then the L for legal or regulatory. Are there new regulations being introduced, or are the regulations being amended, tightened up? Are there legal or regulatory things that we need to consider when identifying risks? And then finally, environmental factors. Do we need to take into account sustainability, green issues, ecological factors, and that sort of thing? That's one way of saying, let's think about what the risks are on a project.
Steve, there's a really good comment from Sukanta, who it sounds slightly obvious in the first instance, and I suspect myself that it's the amount of times that you review. But Sukanta asks, how do you address the risk of the risk management process itself being effective? And I think there's something in there from Ron's piece about residual risk. I would expect we would be managing our risk management process because of the things that we have learned in the past, because of the lessons that we have learned, and because of our constant review. But I wonder if you could just talk about having a really, how do we know we've got a relevant risk management process?
Okay, as a couple of things spring to mind on that question. Thank you, Andrew. First, thought really is regarding the roles and responsibilities in the risk management process, and putting it quite bluntly, what we can say is we've already talked about the people who have responsibility for making the responses happen, the risk owners. And we can also think about the role in relation to risks of the project leader or project manager. And what we can say about that is it's the project manager's responsibility to make sure that a suitable risk management process is deployed. They may be the risk owner for some of the risk actions as well, but it's their responsibility to make sure that risks are assessed and that a risk management process is in place. But what we haven't talked about in any of this yet so far is the role of the project sponsor in relation to risk, which is the project sponsor's role is about business benefits. It's about making the decision that, yes, we're going to do this project, knowing not only what the likely returns are likely to be, what the likely costs are likely to be, but what the level of risk is in the project, which takes us back to this risk appetite. So who is it who's setting the risk appetite? Well, ordinarily it would be the project sponsor. But the question originally started was how do we know that the risk management process is a good process? And one thing that I'm incredibly keen on, and I think it's a thing that most organisations don't do very well, and yet it has tremendous rewards at very little cost, and that is to make sure that when any project finishes, the lessons that we can learn from that project are recorded for future projects. In other words, we do project reviews, lessons learned reports, and that will include things about the issues and risks that happened on that project. And from that, there's a continuous improvement loop which says we can improve our risk management process by taking account of what's happened on previous projects, so that we don't find that history repeats itself. But as an organisation, we're kind of elevating upping the game when it comes to risk management. Don't think I want to say any more about that right now. Does that help, Andrew?
I think that really outlines some of the considerations that we've got to be taking, and we're getting a number of comments in, Steve, about how do you analyse the new risks that arise from implementing a solution to a registered risk. And one of the things that's obvious is that this is a continuous and it's a joined-up process that we've constantly got to be reviewing, adding, subtracting, as you said about 5 or 6 slides ago, because some risks will go away. But in taking individual actions, we have the potential to create either another issue or another risk. And I think probably, Steve, constant review is the way to make sure that we're on top of as many risks as we can see.
Yes, thank you. There was a question. Yes, there was a question about how do we analyse new risks arising from implementing a solution to a risk that we've already identified. And that's a really good point. Of course, we should say, are the new activities, the new tasks that we're putting into the project, actually going to potentially introduce some more risks? Let me just give you one example of this, which I need to be very brief about this because time's marching on. But to say, in the light of the 9/11 attacks in the United States, in the period following those attacks, perhaps understandably, there was a reluctance for population to travel by air. And so air travel numbers went significantly down. And there's a German professor whose name I can't remember or pronounce, but has done some research on this and has calculated that in the 12 months following the 9/11 attack, because people were traveling more by car, there was an extra 1,600 deaths on the road in that 12-month period as a result of people not traveling by air. So it's a really good point that when we put in place new actions, we need to consider what are the risks in those actions themselves. Moving along, before we leave this slide on identifying risks, the last just word on that slide I need to explain. Workshop. What I mean by that is a way of identifying risks is if you are the project manager or the project leader, get the team together. If you've got several people working on a project, then it can be really, really helpful to get the group together to consider what are the things that we should be concerned about in the way of risks on this project. You might think, well, that's going to be a bit demotivating, isn't it? Saying to everybody, oh, what could possibly go wrong? Let's list all the things out that are going to could possibly go wrong. Actually, I think it's quite the opposite. It can be quite positively motivating for the group together to decide which are the risks that they think are the most significant ones, which are the ones that are the most important, and to see that we're doing something about it, that their concerns have not only been aired and voiced, but actually there's a response in there that's a positive motivator, and you get the benefit then of more brains together trying to make sure that we don't miss any of the potential risks. Let's just have another question at this point in time here. I've got various risk statements here. We have never done this before. The objectives aren't clear. We might not have sufficient people. Our estimates are always optimistic. They're quite broad brush risk statements. But I would ask you this question. Which of these are good descriptions of a risk? Thank you, Rachel. Rachel's put a poll up on the chat box here. Hope you can see that. Which of these things are risks? Shall we give you a minute or so to respond to this, and then hopefully Rachel will be able to summarize the findings here. What do you think? Which of these are genuine good descriptions of a risk? So, Rachel, do we have some numbers on this one? Thank you for everybody who has voted on this. The poll has ended. So let me see what this is saying. Okay, so let's have a look at the results here. A, we've never done this before, 4%. The objectives aren't clear, 8%. We might not have sufficient people, 12%. Our estimates are always optimistic, 1%. All of the above, 43%. Now, I know you may take me to task on this one, but the way I'm looking at this, we could say some of these things are issues. And remember the difference between an issue and a risk. An issue is now, a risk is something that might happen in the future. So arguably I would say that C, we might not have sufficient people. Now when the time comes, when we get to this activity, we might not have sufficient people, that's a risk. The others, A, B, and D, are issues. We need to do something about this. It's happened. It's now. So if we were doing a qualification exam in project management, it's really quite important to understand the difference between issues and risks. But all of those things, of course, if that's true, if they're true, they're all important. They're all significant. We need to consider what to do about all of those things. Thank you for your votes on that. Let's think about how we can assess and prioritize risks. For any risk on any project anywhere in the world, we can say there are two independent factors that we need to consider. First of all, what are the chances of it happening? What's the likelihood? What's the probability of this thing happening? And then the second attribute that we need to consider is the impact, the seriousness. How bad would it be to the overall project if this risk happened? And for both of those things, we can quantify the risk in various different ways, depending on how much time and precision we want to go into. We could go, is it simply high, medium, or low? Which seems very, very broad brush, but it normally will highlight the most important risks where we've got a high likelihood and a high impact. They're the ones that we need to do something about. Or we could score the likelihood and the impact, 1 to 5, 1 to 10, that sort of thing. Another way of looking at it is to say let's quantify the likelihood as a percentage probability and the impact as how much would it cost us to put this right if it did happen. We'll come back to see how this works.
Steve, there's some good, a good comment which feels about right to bring it in now from Niall, who says, are there benchmarks for assessing the impact of a risk, or is it down to our own engineering judgment?
Well, I think yes, there are, but what I would suggest here is that what we're trying to do, and this is it's the point I was coming to on this slide here, is that there will probably be, as you go through and work this out, there will probably be some risks which are judged to be, if you like, in the top 20%, the ones that we really need to do something about. It says they're listed in order of severity on the project to use a Pareto approach, or the 80-20 principle. So Pareto, for those who are not familiar with this, this terminology, Pareto was a 19th century Italian economist who discovered or worked out that 80% of Italy's wealth resided with 20% of the people. And that word, Pareto, has now been kind of appropriated to use any time where there's an 80-20 principle at stake. And what we're saying here is probably the top 20% of risks are going to give you 80% of the benefit in terms of the management. And what we're saying here is it's important to identify those, and even a very broad brush, even the kind of low, medium, high thing that I was mentioning on the previous slide will quite often be adequate to find out what we're trying to do. We could spend a lot of time kind of saying, you know, if we were scoring them out of 100 or 10 or something like, you know, is this a 6 or is it a 7? And that's probably not going to be as useful spending time doing that than it is saying, look, we need to do something about the most important risks, rather than having what some people call analysis paralysis of going to the nth degree. That's a kind of practical, pragmatic approach on my part. I know some people might see it differently.
Thanks, Steve. That's great.
Okay. Moving right along. We're thinking about now responses to risk. What is it that we can do? So, first thing that we can do is reduce the risk. We can reduce the risk in two ways. We could either reduce the likelihood, reduce the probability. There may be some actions that we can take to reduce the chances of this thing happening, or we could have some a response that reduces the impact, so that if it does happen, we have a way of reducing it. Well, that's the first thing. We could reduce the severity of the risk. Another thing that we could do is eliminate the risk. So, for instance, an example I quoted earlier on was the risk that software development might run behind schedule, might be late. One way of eliminating that would be to say, well, we won't develop our own in-house software. We'll buy some off-the-shelf software which will introduce other risks. So the risk of the software being late would be eliminated, but a risk might be that it doesn't have exactly the functionality that we're originally looking for. So reduce or eliminate. Transfer is another response to risk. For instance, taking out an insurance policy is a way of transferring risk. And then there are some risks where the likelihood is so exceedingly low that what we decide to do is to accept that risk. And we'll see how that works in just a minute. Something that's often comes up in relation to risk management is the idea of including some contingency, a little bit of extra, a little bit of buffer, some contingency time in our project schedule. And if you have a project where meeting the end date is absolutely vital, I know you're the project manager for an Olympic stadium and you can't delay the Olympic Games, then it's very important to have some contingency in the plan. Otherwise, you don't have any contingency. As soon as one thing goes wrong, it's always got to run just to stand still. And we're going to have a look in a moment at a distributed versus lumped model. We'll talk about that on the next slide. But just to say this, if you do have some contingency time in a project plan, then there needs to be some corresponding contingency budget. If you need to use the time, then the effort that is going in during that time needs to be budgeted for as well. And it's not always obvious about that. we'll think also about how to justify contingency and make sure we don't have double counting. Have a look at this. I've put on this slide three approaches. The first one, we've got three activities here, just a section out of the project schedule. Activity A followed by activity B followed by activity C. And we've got the first case where there's no contingency included in there. The second case where, if you can see in the second example, A is a little bit longer than the A in the first one, B is a little bit longer than the B in the first example, and C is a little bit longer than the C in the first one. So we've added a little bit of contingency time to each of these tasks. So we've multiplied the time estimate by a certain factor to include a little bit of contingency. And then the third example is where A, B, and C have the same predicted durations as in the first example, but there's an amount of contingency D, which is what I would call lumped at the end. So my question is, which of these do you think you would adopt? Which one would you like to adopt? What would you use? A, no contingency. B, distributed across the task, or C, lumped at the end. You can see Rachel's put up another poll. Thank you, Rachel. 45 seconds to have a go at doing this. And we'll have a talk about this, and then we'll also talk about how you might justify putting some contingency into your project plan. I saw there was a question about that a moment ago. Okay, poll has ended, and I expect that in just a moment.
There's a very good behavioural observation that's come in just recently about adding risk in as actually something that can be used up. So, adding a contingency in so that it can be used up. And I must admit, I do have some experience of this in profit and loss accounts where we like to put in a provision for risk, which fairly rapidly becomes part of your extended marketing budget because really you wanted to do something else with it. And I suppose, Steve, that's behavioural, isn't it? That's about the leader of the project making sure that there is a sensible, realistic, applicable contingency to the project that fits with the client or customer, be they internal or external, and is built in as a sensible buffer and not something where people can relax for the last day or this week.
Yes, Andrew, that's the point of this slide, really. And Rachel, I'm not seeing the results to this poll at the moment. Am I doing something wrong? Can you put up the results here? Maybe not. Anyway, let's have a look at this, because I think it's maybe behavioural, but I think there's something else here that we kind of invites that behaviour if we're not careful, and it's not just careful, it's about I would say it's about the organisational culture rather than the individual behaviour. So somebody made the comment of, if the end date is not fixed, then you don't need to have contingency. Quite agree. Not every project has a high-profile, absolutely critical end date. Some do, some don't. We're talking here about contingency models where there is a very firm, fixed end date. And I've seen a lot of project managers do what I've called number 2 there, distributed across tasks. And I think there is to my mind, there is a problem with that, and it's kind of the thing that you just described, Andrew, which is, you can imagine if the person who's doing activity A finishes their activity according to what the plan says, hands over to the person doing B, they finish and hand over to the next person. As you go along, the contingency, which was there in case things went wrong, is being eroded, it's being squandered, it's being thrown away, even though perhaps the risks in those activities have not happened. And yet, and this is the important bit, those people who've done those activities would say, well, I did a good job. I delivered on time. I did what the plan said. I delivered on schedule with my activities. But the contingency, which should belong to the project manager, in my view, is being thrown away. In the example number 3, where the contingency is lumped at the end, you now have another metric on the project, which is how much of my contingency I started off with have I currently got left? So you can use that as a metric. There are some difficulties. I would not pretend that there aren't some difficulties with 3, and one of them is the powers that be may very well look at the plan and go, well, what's this contingency? What's that for? And try and take it out and say, well, you don't need that. Take the contingency out. And this is where it becomes important that we're able to justify how much contingency is put into the plan. And the way to do that, in my view, is to go back to this risk register that we're in the process of constructing at the moment and say, yes, the top 20% of risks, perhaps, we've got some specific actions, some responses in there to reduce the likelihood, to reduce the impact, and that sort of thing. But we've got a whole load of other risks that admittedly are low likelihood or low impact that we haven't got specific actions for, because if we did, the project plan would be unfeasibly long. But we have got some risks where there aren't any specific actions, and the contingency time, what I've shown as D in that little chart, is there for those risks that are, we could say they're the unmitigated risks. We haven't got any mitigating actions for these risks. So you can justify the magnitude of contingency. More risks that haven't got specific actions equals more contingency. It's not a magic wand to say that the powers that be will accept that. But it's a logical, persuasive argument that says we need to have this if we've got a fixed deadline on this particular project. Andrew, your response? Are you there?
No, I am here, Steve, and it really is interesting. We've had a really high degree of fascinating comments about contingency. It's really touched a nerve from some great examples like don't call it contingency, which actually in some cases I would absolutely agree with. Don't give people the opportunity. Really
I think, Andrew, you mentioned your background of seeing this in financial environments, and it's very, very common for people who are used to putting together financial predictions, department budgets, and that sort of thing, is they will want some contingency, but they'll lose it under a different heading somewhere. I'm not suggesting that you do that, but I have known people who've said, we'll put an activity in, like I've got a D on this slide here. We won't call it contingency. We'll call it something obtuse, like integration testing. And the client will be too embarrassed to admit that they don't know what that means, and we get away with it that way. I'm not suggesting that, but I have come across that.
Yeah, absolutely perfect. And you're mirroring some of the comments that are coming in. And one, I think one great final one from me, an observation from Helen, who says, if A finishes early, maybe B can't actually start. Maybe the sort of critical path nature of a project is absolutely vital, because it could almost be down tools for 2 or 3 days or 2 or 3 weeks because B wasn't set up to start early. This project planning is a fine art, isn't it? There's no doubt about that.
Absolutely. Let's just think about actioning our responses here. So as a project manager, what are our responsibilities? It includes some of these things: deciding who's the risk owner for each risk, agreeing a target date for the completion of those risk activities, making sure the actions are included in the project plan, and then vitally important, this risk management, not risk analysis or risk assessment, monitoring against the plan to make sure that the actions to reduce risks are actually happening. I've worked with various clients who say, oh yeah, we have a risk register for every project. It's part of our project management methodology. We have to fill out a risk register. And when I say to them, so what do you do with it after you've filled it out? I kind of get a blank look where they say, well, I've done it, I finished it. Don't have to do anything with it. What do you mean? Actually, this risk register is the beginning of risk management, not the end of it. We've got to go monitor and make sure that these things are happening. And let's have a look here. I'm just going to build up a very simplistic example here as we go through it. Here's the foundations of a risk register for a new product introduction, and you can see here the various risks have been identified: software development, overruns, hardware board needs an extra iteration, a failure of some key test equipment. There's a risk maybe the competition might introduce something that's like this or better before we introduce ours, or maybe a component supplier might be unable to supply. And then the next step would be to assess the the relative probabilities. In this example, I've just said, let's score it 1 to 5, the relative probability. So with the group, we might have a discussion about this and say, well, which are the most important ones? And I've arbitrarily put some numbers in there just to see how this works. So we've got a 4 at the top, etc. And then we could say the impact score. Now remember, impact is answering this question. If this risk did happen, how important would it be to the overall project success? So I've put in here some examples to say the most important one might be, from an impact point of view, would be perhaps the competition that visas to the marketplace. The least impactful would be perhaps an extra iteration on the circuit board. Then I've put in this column the severity, which we are taking these two scores for probability and impact, multiplying them together, putting the product of those two numbers in here to give the overall significance or severity of prioritising the risks. So multiplying those together gives us the scores in that fourth column. And then we might say, okay, so what could we do to reduce these risks? First up there, the software development time overrun row in the risk register. We've said, okay, let's triage, let's prioritize the functionality with the client. Some of you will be familiar with the Moscow technique, which is it's an acronym for what are the things that we must do, what are the things we should do, what are the things we could do, and what are the things that we won't do. So taking the functionality requirements and saying, well, what are the absolute essentials, the non-negotiable, mandatory, we must do these things, let's make sure that we do those. It might be one of the responses to that particular risk. And then the next one is what we were just talking about, including some contingency in there. Notice I've put a magnitude on that. I've said 3 weeks contingency included. Rather than just saying, let's have some contingency, it's important to be specific, to be able to look at these risks and say, let's quantify it, let's have a number in here. Then the failure of test equipment, well, it might be that this is an example of transferring a risk. Taking out insurance is a way of transferring a risk. We've got one here with, we're saying take no action here. Although it's got the highest impact on this project, the competition introducing a similar or better product before we did, we're saying, well, there isn't actually anything that we decided to do about it. You see how it works out. And then the last column is, excuse me, identifying who the risk owners are for each of these risks that we've got on our risk register. What I'd like to say, that's kind of a quick run through of how to use the risk register. A couple of things I would like to talk about: avoiding common pitfalls and making it work. Some common pitfalls to avoid briefly here. Somebody called it the distant elephant syndrome or the student syndrome. The student syndrome is, I've got to hand an essay in 3 weeks' time, so I've got 2.5 weeks off. In other words, this thing is a long way away. We don't need to worry about it yet. Well, maybe we do. A really common pitfall is to have non-measurable actions. I like to see numbers, something numerical, something measurable in there, and the words to avoid are relative terms, such as better, improved, high quality, that sort of thing. We need some measurable actions in there to make this work, really. Another pitfall would be not asking the team, not listening to the concerns of the team. They're probably correct in the things that they are worried about. Overconfidence in estimates, I think we've all come across this. Daniel Kahneman calls it the planning fallacy. We plan as if the journey would have every traffic light on green when we get there. Let's be realistic. Let's use our lessons learned reports, our past projects, to work out what is a realistic estimate, not including any contingency. On the upside, cost of changes in stakeholder influence, what this is saying is that at the beginning of a project where changing some things is only about some paperwork, the cost of that is very, very low. We've got high influence to do that. As you go through the project right to the far end on the right-hand side, where the way in which we can influence the outcome, the product, the outcomes, the benefits is very low, and the cost of a product recall, for instance, if it goes right to the right-hand side, is enormous. So it's important to act early and do this quickly. Things to make it work well: have a risk workshop. Harness the brain power of the team to identify risks. make sure you use past experience. Somebody put a comment up that says every project should include reading the previous lessons and assessing lessons learned reports. Absolutely, that's a brilliant thing to do. Word I like to use about risk action is binary, making sure that it's either happened or it's not happened. We've written it in such a way that we can see that, that the risk action has happened. Considering, as somebody mentioned earlier, whether the new risks are introduced by the actions that we've put in place to manage some of the other risks, like the 9/11 one, have a risk owner, and being realistic, being honest, open, realistic about it, are things that I think are things that will turn this from just a paperwork exercise into something that means that on the journey you get to the destination successfully. A couple of examples just to finish off with now. The NASA Mars probe, some of you will be familiar with this, that the Mars probe had problems when it got to the Mars orbit because there was an inaccurate conversion of imperial to metric. It sounds unbelievable, doesn't it? But it happened. What was interesting to me was that the subsequent inquiry and investigation didn't single out the poor little engineer who used the wrong coefficient here, but it was cited as a failure of project management. They were saying the project manager didn't place enough emphasis on having a successful mission, and what do we need to do to manage those risks? It's a really important one. And another one that I like to consider is the case of the Panama Canal. There's a long and intricate history of the Panama Canal that I'm trying to summarize very briefly over here, but millions of shovelfuls of earth had happened, but very little progress and success with the Panama Canal. When new leadership took over in the early 20th century, what they did was creating the conditions so that the project could be a success. They spent 2 years setting up bakeries and villages and food supplies and medical centres and all that sort of stuff so that the project then was rapidly finished off and has been the success that it has been ever since. So, in summary, where we've got to, we've looked at why we should bother, the language of risk, the process and techniques, how to respond to risks, and a few hints and tips to avoid common pitfalls. That takes us to the end of my slides, and if I could work out how to move this back to Andrea.
Steve, one thing while you're moving the ball back to me, thank you for using all the contingency planning that I know you had. There was one wonderful jocular suggestion about 10 minutes ago that perhaps we'd use the contingency up in the presentation, and oddly enough, for those of you who are still on the line, I know the project plan that Steve had written, the detailed timings by which time you should be at each slide, and I'm delighted we've arrived at the destination with about 2 minutes to go. And I know you're going to drop the ball back to me for a couple of slides in a minute or two, Steve, and if you can, that would be lovely. But could you just go, Graham Fowler asked a question about HAZOP, and wondered when HAZOP would come into the sphere of managing projects and managing risk. Do you need any more details on that, or is that something that you
That's not something that's in my sphere of experience, Andrew, and I think one of the things that project managers have to do is not be afraid of saying, I don't know, sometimes. And I'm not going to pretend on this one because it's not something that's been in my, in all the projects that I've worked on, and I've worked on many over the last 40 years, that's not something that's been in my sphere, so I'm not going to wing it.
Okay, that's absolutely, do you know what? This mirrors Rupen's comment as we go. A good project manager he is his summary of you, Steve. So brave and courageous about what we don't know, as well as knowledgeable and articulate about what we do know. Awesome timing and tackled the risk of too many questions superbly. Rupen, thank you. That's a great bit of feedback. Thank you for all of you who've stayed with us. We've been absolutely delighted to see so many questions. It just shows the engagement and the interest that you've actually got. We have plenty of related training programs that are coming up this year. There will be some more that are taking place next year as well. You might be interested in some of these dates from Glasgow into Bristol, across London, where we will be delivering these training courses on project management. So So, Steve, thank you very much, very, very much again. Thank you also to everybody who's participated, particularly those in different time zones. We're delighted to have you. We know that you're not just sitting there with a sandwich like a lot of us have been, so thank you for the effort. Thanks very much indeed. Please keep a lookout for the other webinars and seminars that we put online. We'd be delighted to see you again. Steve, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Rachel.